What is the relationship between gambling and mental health? Alma Economics was recently commissioned by the British charity GambleAware to explore this issue. Economist Sarah Neubauer was a member of the research team.
So GambleAware commissions a survey every year through YouGov called the Treatment Support Survey. And they had 3 waves of this data from November 2020 to November 2022. And they wanted to use this really, rich data source to look at the relationship between mental health and gambling.
It is estimated that in 2020, in Great Britain, around 29 million people participated in gambling. By 2022, this figure had surpassed 31 million, a rise of about 9%. This includes people who gamble with little to no harm, people at risk of harm, and people actively experiencing problem gambling. And this last group has grown by a disproportionate amount. Alma's analysis indicates that between 2020 and 2022, the number of people experiencing problem gambling jumped 23%, from 1.2 to almost 1.5 million people across Great Britain. But how do we estimate an individual's risk of gambling harm? One key measure is the Problem Gambling Severity Index, or PGSI.
The Problem Gambling Severity Index, or the PGSI, is a scoring mechanism questionnaire that is used to measure how harmful someone's gambling is or is becoming. The questions on the PGSI questionnaire measure things like, have you ever gambled more than you could afford to lose? Have you ever been concerned for your gambling? Has anyone ever told you that you gamble too much? The questionnaire sums each question to a total of either between 0 and 27. Anyone with a score between 1 and 8 is deemed at risk of problematic gambling, and anyone with a score of 8 or higher is considered someone who's experiencing problematic gambling.
Over the same period, which coincided with the COVID pandemic and the onset of the cost of living crisis, the number of mental health diagnoses in Great Britain also grew significantly. The data indicates that in 2022, the number of people with a mental health diagnosis reached 7.5 million, up 500,000, or 11%, compared to 2020. The most common diagnoses were depression, anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Alma's analysis further showed that there is a significant association between mental health diagnoses and problem gambling. The data shows that those experiencing problem gambling are more likely to have a mental health diagnosis than those who gamble without harm or not at all. More specifically, people with a PGSI score of 0 are estimated to have a 22% chance of having a diagnosed mental health condition, while for individuals with a PGSI score of 8, the probability rises to almost 40%. However, this association does not apply equally to all mental health conditions. For example, higher PGSI scores are more strongly associated with anger disorders and with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. When we look at the whole of Great Britain, those with a PGSI score of 8 or more make up only 2.7% of the population. However, when we look at Britons with ADHD, we find that those with a PGSI score of 8 or above make us almost 15% of all individuals. And in the case of intermittent explosive disorder, those in the PGSI 8+ category account for almost a quarter. But researchers stress that the precise nature of the link between mental health diagnoses and gambling harms remains unclear.
So unfortunately, we can't say that this relationship is causal because the mechanisms that we used aren't causal. We used regression analysis and descriptive analysis and correlations. We can say that there's an association, meaning that people who have higher PGSI scores or are more likely to experience gambling harms tend to have worse mental health. And we can also say that people who have different mental health disorders are more likely to experience gambling harms or have a higher PGSI score. But this relationship isn't causal because we need different mechanisms such as an experiment or some kind of other quasi-experimental method to identify a causal relationship, which is an area of future research that would be very interesting to go into.
While causality remains an open question, it is clear that those with high PGSI scores experience greater negative outcomes. For example, while 6% of non-gamblers report having had suicidal thoughts over the past year, for those experiencing problem gambling, this rises to over 30%.
The benefit of this research is that the more evidence that we have in this area, the more that we can help people who are experiencing gambling harms, and we can identify the fact that there might be other things that need help with.
For more information, read the full report at almaeconomics.com. And if you are worried about how gambling makes you or someone you love feel, GambleAware can help. Follow the links in the video description for confidential support.